This 1869 portrait of two children looks close until you notice the rope burn. It seemed like an ordinary studio portrait at first. Two girls, maybe 7 or 8 years old, seated side by side in matching calico dresses, the kind of photograph you might find in any family album from the period, until one detail would not let the investigator go. Dr. Nadine Alcott had been working as a visual culture specialist at a university archive in Richmond for 11 years. She had cataloged thousands of 19th century photographs, images of senators and school children and soldiers, of wedding parties and funeral processions, of families posing stiffly for portraits that cost them a week's wages. She thought she had seen everything these collections could offer. But in March of 2019, a private donor dropped off a cardboard box that would change how she understood her own field. The box had belonged to a family named Hargrave. The Hargraves had been tobacco merchants in central Virginia for 5 generations before their line died out in the 1980s. The last surviving heir, a great-nephew in California who had never set foot in Virginia, had no interest in the contents. He wanted a tax write-off, not history. So the archive received everything: account books, letters, receipts, and a small envelope of photographs. Most of the photographs were unremarkable. Men in dark suits standing in front of brick warehouses, women holding infants in baptismal gowns. But one image stopped Nadine cold. It was a carte de visite, the small card-mounted photograph popular in the 1860s and 1870s. 2 girls sat on a velvet-covered settee. The girl on the left was white, with light brown ringlets and a lace collar. The girl on the right was black, her hair parted down the middle and braided tightly against her scalp. They wore identical dresses, pale fabric with small dark flowers. Their hands were clasped together between them. At first glance, it looked like affection, like friendship. Then Nadine looked closer. The black girl's free hand rested in her lap, and around her wrist, just visible above the cuff of her dress, was a band of discolored skin. The mark was faint in the photograph, easy to miss if you were looking at the composition as a whole. But under Nadine's magnifying glass, it became unmistakable. The skin was abraded, raw-looking, the kind of mark left by something that had been tied there, repeatedly, over a long period of time. Rope burn. The white girl's wrists were smooth, unmarked. She smiled faintly, chin lifted. The black girl's expression was harder to read. Her eyes looked directly at the camera, but there was something guarded in them, something that didn't match the clasped hands and matching dresses. Nadine turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded brown ink, someone had written 2 names: Eugenia and her companion Dinah, 1869. Her companion. The word hung in Nadine's mind. In 1869, 4 years after the end of the Civil War, 4 years after emancipation, what did companion mean? And why did Dinah have rope burns on her wrist? This was not just a pretty old photo. Something here was wrong. Nadine had spent the better part of her career studying the visual archive of the American South. She had written papers on how enslaved people were photographed, on the conventions of antebellum portraiture, on the ways white families staged images of domestic harmony while violence simmered just outside the frame. She knew that photographs from this era were never neutral. They were performances, carefully arranged to project wealth, respectability, and order. But she had never seen anything quite like this. Most photographs of enslaved or formerly enslaved people from this period fell into predictable categories. There were the images taken by abolitionists, intended to generate sympathy and outrage. There were the images taken by enslavers themselves, documenting their property with the same detachment they might photograph a prize horse. And there were the images taken after emancipation, in which black subjects finally had some control over how they were represented. These post-war photographs often showed people in their Sunday best, seated in dignified poses, reclaiming the visual conventions that had been used to dehumanize them. This photograph did not fit any of those categories. The matching dresses suggested equality. The clasped hands suggested intimacy. But the rope burn told a different story. Someone had gone to great lengths to make this photograph look like a portrait of 2 friends. But Dinah had been restrained. Nadine carefully removed the carte de visite from its paper sleeve and placed it on the light table. She adjusted her scanner, setting the resolution high enough to capture every grain in the paper, every variation in tone. Then she began to examine the image systematically, inch by inch, looking for anything else she might have missed. The photographer's studio stamp was embossed in the lower left corner. J.W. Caldwell, Main Street, Lynchburg. That was useful. Lynchburg was about 60 miles from Richmond. If Caldwell had kept records, there might be more information about when and why this photograph was taken. On the back of the card, below the names, Nadine noticed something else she had missed before. A small number, written in pencil, 14. It could have been a filing number or a sequence number from a larger series. Were there other photographs of these children? Had the Hargraves commissioned multiple portraits? She looked at the two girls again. Eugenia's posture was relaxed, confident. She leaned slightly toward the camera, as if she were used to being looked at, used to being admired. Dinah sat perfectly still, her spine rigid, her shoulders squared. It was the posture of someone trying very hard not to draw attention to herself. And then there were their hands. At first, Nadine had assumed the clasp was genuine, that both girls were participating equally. But now she saw that Eugenia's fingers were wrapped around Dinah's wrist, gripping it. Dinah's own fingers were limp, passive. She was not holding Eugenia's hand. She was being held. Nadine felt a chill run down her spine. She had cataloged enough images to recognize when a photograph was telling a different story than the one its creators intended. And this photograph was screaming. If she ignored this, a buried story stayed buried. That was not something she could live with. The obvious place to start was the photographer. J.W. Caldwell's studio had operated in Lynchburg from 1858 to 1884, a span that covered the war years and Reconstruction. Nadine found a few references to him in local newspaper advertisements. He had specialized in portraits, carte de visite, and what one ad called memorial images of the departed. He seemed to have been a competent technician, nothing more. No evidence of abolitionist sympathies, no indication that he had any particular interest in documenting the lives of Black Virginians. The Hargrave family was easier to trace. The box of documents the archive had received included deeds, wills, and tax records going back to the 1820s. By 1860, the Hargraves had owned a tobacco warehouse in Lynchburg and a plantation called Whitfield, about 15 miles outside town. They had also owned, according to the 1860 census slave schedules, 37 enslaved people. Nadine pulled up the slave schedule and scanned the entries. The census did not record names, only ages, genders, and skin colors. But she found what she was looking for: a female child, age 3, listed as Black. If that child had survived, she would have been about 7 years old in 1869, the right age to be Dinah. The white population census from 1860 filled in more of the picture. The head of household was William T. Hargrave, age 42, occupation merchant. His wife was Martha, age 38. They had 4 children: William Jr., age 16, Thomas, age 12, Eugenia, age 4, and an infant named Clara who had died before the 1870 census was taken. Eugenia Hargrave, the girl in the photograph. Nadine reached out to a colleague, Dr. Marcus Cole, a historian at a university in Atlanta who specialized in post-emancipation labor arrangements in the Upper South. She sent him scans of the photograph and the Hargrave documents and asked if he could make sense of what she was seeing. Marcus called her back within a day. "I've seen images like this before," he said. "Not many, but enough to recognize the pattern. That word on the back, companion. It's not innocent. It's a legal term, or close to one." He explained that in the years immediately after the war, Southern states had passed a series of laws known as the Black Codes. These laws were designed to keep Black people in conditions as close to slavery as possible. One of the most insidious provisions involved children. Under Virginia law, a court could apprentice Black minors to white employers if their parents were deemed unable to provide for them. In practice, this meant that orphaned children, children of single mothers, and children whose parents were too poor to fight back could be taken and bound to labor until they turned 21. The word for this arrangement was often companion, especially when the child was placed in a domestic setting, Marcus said. The idea was that a Black child would be raised alongside a white child of the same age and gender. They would share lessons, share meals, share a bedroom. In exchange for this supposed privilege, the Black child was expected to serve the white child in every way, to carry her books, to dress her hair, to sleep at the foot of her bed, ready to fetch water or light a candle in the middle of the night. Nadine thought of the matching dresses, the clasped hands, and the rope burn. That's the part people don't like to talk about, Marcus said. These children were not there voluntarily. When they tried to run or when they resisted, they were punished. Sometimes that meant whipping. Sometimes it meant restraint. I've seen court records describing children being tied to beds, tied to posts, tied to the white children they were supposed to serve. Nadine looked at the photograph again. Eugenia's fingers wrapped around Dinah's wrist, the rope burn just visible above the cuff. The photograph is documentation, she said slowly. They were documenting their ownership. In a way. After 1865, slaveholders couldn't list black children as property on a census anymore, but they still wanted to mark them, to claim them. A photograph like this served that purpose. It said, "This child belongs to our family. She is our Eugenia's companion. She is not free to leave." But something still did not add up. If Dinah had been apprenticed through the courts, there should be a record of the transaction. Nadine began searching the Lynchburg court archives for apprenticeship indentures filed between 1865 and 1870. She found dozens, most of them for black children bound to white farmers and tradesmen, but she could not find one for Dinah. Either the record had been lost or Dinah's apprenticeship had never been formalized, which raised another question. If the Hargraves had not gone through the courts, how had they kept Dinah? And what had happened to her family? Nadine drove to Lynchburg on a cold Saturday in April. The Whitfield plantation was long gone, subdivided and developed in the 1950s. But the old Hargrave house in town still stood, converted now into a bed and breakfast with a historical plaque by the front door. The plaque mentioned the family's role in the tobacco trade. It did not mention slavery. The Campbell County Courthouse had survived the war and kept records going back to the 1780s. Nadine spent 2 days in the basement archive, working through boxes of loose papers and crumbling ledgers. What she found changed everything she thought she knew about the photograph. In the spring of 1866, a freedwoman named Louisa Meeks had filed a complaint with the Freedmen's Bureau in Lynchburg. The complaint stated that her daughter Diana had been taken and retained by the Hargrave family against her will. Louisa claimed that Diana had been born on the Hargrave plantation before the war, and that the Hargraves were refusing to return her now that slavery had ended. Diana, not Dinah, but close enough. The Freedmen's Bureau had investigated. An agent named Captain Thomas Morse had visited the Hargrave home and interviewed both Louisa and Martha Hargrave. His report was still in the file, written in neat copperplate script. Mrs. Hargrave states that the child in question, called Diana, was given to her daughter Eugenia as a birthday present in April of 1864. She states that the child has been raised as a member of the household and is happy in her position. She states that she has no intention of returning the child to her mother, whom she describes as an unfit parent. Given as a birthday present. The words landed like stones. Captain Morse had also interviewed Louisa. The complainant states that her daughter was taken from her by force in April of 1864, when the child was 3 years old. She states that she was not consulted and did not consent. She states that she has attempted to see her daughter on multiple occasions and has been turned away at the door. She states that she fears for her daughter's safety and well-being. The Bureau's decision was brief. Upon investigation, it appears that the child Diana has been cared for by the Hargrave family and shows no signs of mistreatment. The complainant's allegations of forcible taking cannot be substantiated. The case is closed. Nadine sat back in her chair. The Bureau had sided with the Hargraves, a white family's word against a black mother's word, and the white family had won. But Louisa Meeks had not given up. Nadine found a second document in the courthouse records, dated 1868. It was a petition filed by Louisa in the county court, asking for a writ of habeas corpus to compel the Hargraves to produce her daughter. The petition described how Louisa had tried every legal avenue available to her. She had gone to the Freedmen's Bureau twice more. She had appealed to local ministers. She had even tried to speak to William Hargrave directly, only to be threatened with arrest for trespassing. The petition was denied. The judge's reasoning was brief. The petitioner has failed to demonstrate that the child is held unlawfully. The respondents are prominent citizens of good character. Prominent citizens of good character. That was the system laid bare. A black mother had no standing to reclaim her own child. The law was not designed to help her. It was designed to keep her child in bondage. Nadine found one more piece of evidence before she left the courthouse. In the Hargrave family papers, tucked between receipts for dry goods and fabric, was a single sheet of foolscap covered in Martha Hargrave's handwriting. It appeared to be a draft of instructions for a seamstress. 2 dresses for the girls, it read. Matching pattern, Eugenia's to have full sleeves, Diana's to have shorter cuffs to account for her condition. Her condition. The rope burns. Martha Hargrave had known about them. She had planned around them. Nadine thought about the photograph again. The way the dresses had been designed to look identical from a distance while hiding the evidence of Diana's restraint. The way Diana's wrist was positioned, almost but not quite concealed by the angle. The way Eugenia gripped her companion's hand, holding her in place for the camera. This was not just a portrait. It was a declaration of ownership, staged and styled to look like affection. And it had fooled everyone who looked at it for 150 years. Dr. Cole introduced Nadine to another expert, Dr. Yolanda Price, an anthropologist who studied the material culture of bondage. Yolanda examined high-resolution scans of the photograph and confirmed what Nadine had suspected. The abraded skin pattern is consistent with repeated binding, she said. Not a single incident, but a chronic condition. This child was tied up regularly, probably at night. The marks would have been fresh when this photograph was taken. Why would they photograph her like that? Nadine asked. Why not wait until the marks healed? Because they didn't see it the way we see it, Yolanda said. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong. This was normal to them. The marks were just part of managing their property. And remember, in 1869, there was no one to answer to. The Bureau was winding down. The courts were sympathetic to white landowners. The Hargraves had no reason to hide anything. Except they had hidden it. The shorter cuffs, the angle of the wrist. They had known enough to be ashamed, or perhaps not ashamed, perhaps just careful, perhaps just aware that some viewers might not understand what they were seeing, that some viewers might think a rope burn on a 7-year-old's wrist was evidence of cruelty rather than discipline. The system behind the photograph was becoming clear. Diana had been stolen from her mother and given to a white child as a living doll. She had been dressed up and displayed, her bondage disguised as friendship. When she tried to escape, she was tied down. When her mother tried to reclaim her, the courts refused to listen. And through it all, the Hargraves had maintained the fiction that they were doing Diana a favor, giving her a home, making her part of the family. That was the real horror. Not just the violence, but the denial of it. The smiling faces and matching dresses and clasped hands, all designed to make bondage look like love. Nadine brought her findings back to the archive and requested a meeting with the director, Dr. Helen Chambers, and the head of public programming. She laid out everything: the photograph, the Freedmen's Bureau, complaint, Louise's petition, the seamstress instructions. She proposed that the archive mount an exhibition around the image, telling the story of Diana and her mother and the system that had torn them apart. The response was not what she had hoped for. "This is powerful material," Dr. Chambers said carefully, "but I have concerns about how we present it. The Hargrave donation came with certain expectations. The family understood that we would be telling their story, preserving their legacy. If we frame this as an indictment of the family, we risk alienating other potential donors." "Other donors who might have similar skeletons in their collections?" Nadine asked. "That's not fair, isn't it? Helen, this photograph has been sitting in our archive for 5 years. If someone had looked at it carefully when it came in, we could have been telling this story all along. Instead, it was filed away as just another family portrait. How many other images in our collection are hiding similar histories?" The head of programming, a younger woman named Sarah Vance, spoke up. "I think Nadine has a point. We've been talking for years about diversifying our exhibitions, about telling stories that aren't just about wealthy white families. This is an opportunity to do that, and it's not like we're making anything up. The documentation is right there." "The documentation is open to interpretation," Dr. Chambers said. "We don't know for certain that the marks on the girl's wrist are rope burns. We don't know for certain that she was held against her will. We have allegations from her mother, but the Bureau investigated and found no evidence of wrongdoing." "The Bureau found no evidence because the Bureau wasn't looking for evidence," Nadine said. They took the word of a white family over the word of a black mother. That's not exoneration. That's the system working exactly as it was designed to work. The meeting ended without resolution. Dr. Chambers said she needed time to consider the options. She suggested that Nadine write up her research as an internal report before any public presentation was discussed. Nadine wrote the report. It took her 3 weeks. When she submitted it, Dr. Chambers thanked her and said she would review it when she had time. Weeks passed, then months. Every time Nadine asked about the report, she got the same answer. It was under consideration. In the meantime, she kept digging. She found a church record from 1871 showing that Louisa Meeks had died of consumption that year at the age of 32. She had never gotten her daughter back. She found an 1880 census record showing a Diana Hargrave, age 19, living as a servant in the Hargrave household, still there, still bound, still called by the name of the family that had taken her. She found a marriage record from 1885 for a Diana Johnson, formerly Hargrave, wed to a freedman named Samuel Johnson in the same county. Diana had survived. She had gotten out eventually. She had started a new life. Nadine began reaching out to genealogical databases and local historical societies, trying to find out if Diana had left any descendants. If she could find Diana's family, she thought, she could tell the story with their voices at the center. The breakthrough came in the spring of 2020. A woman named Carlene Washington, living in Baltimore, responded to one of Nadine's inquiries. Carlene was Diana's great-great-granddaughter. She had never heard of the photograph. "My grandmother used to talk about her grandmother Diana," Carlene said during their first phone call. She said Diana never talked much about her childhood. She said there was pain there that Diana kept locked away, but she never knew the details. Nadine sent Carlene scans of the photograph and the documents. Carlene was silent for a long time. "That's her," she said finally. "That's my great-great-grandmother. She was just a little girl, and they did that to her." Carlene agreed to participate in whatever exhibition or publication Nadine could put together. She wanted the story told. She wanted people to know what had been done to her ancestor. Armed with Carlene's support, Nadine went back to Dr. Chambers. This time she brought Sarah Vance and 2 other sympathetic colleagues. They argued that the archive had a responsibility to center the voices of the people who had been exploited, not just the families who had done the exploiting. They argued that donors who would be alienated by honest history were not donors worth courting. They argued that telling the truth was the entire point of their work. Dr. Chambers listened, and then to Nadine's surprise, she agreed. "I've been thinking about this for months," she said. "You're right. We've been telling one side of the story for too long. If we're going to be a serious archive, we have to reckon with what our collections actually contain." The exhibition opened in February of 2022. It was called Companion, Bondage, Resistance, and Family in Post-Emancipation Virginia. The photograph of Eugenia and Diana was the centerpiece, displayed in a climate-controlled case with the magnified image of Diana's wrist projected on the wall beside it. The wall text told the full story: the taking, the complaints, the legal battles, the rope burns hidden by shorter cuffs. Carlene Washington came to the opening. She stood in front of the photograph for a long time, not speaking. When Nadine approached her, she saw that Carlene was crying. "She was so little," Carlene said. "She was just a baby when they took her, and she spent her whole childhood being somebody else's property, being somebody else's toy. But she got out," Nadine said. "She survived. She had children and grandchildren and you. She did." Carlene wiped her eyes. She made a life for herself. She was strong. Stronger than they knew. The exhibition included excerpts from oral histories that Diana's granddaughter had given to a local interviewer in the 1930s. One passage, Diana's granddaughter described her grandmother's hands. "Grandma Diana had marks on her wrists her whole life. She said they never faded. She used to wear long sleeves even in summer to cover them up. When I asked her where they came from, she just shook her head. She said some things were better left in the past, but I could tell they hurt her. Not the marks themselves, but what they meant, what they reminded her of. The marks had lasted a lifetime. The photograph had captured them at their freshest, in 1869, when Diana was 7 years old and her mother was still fighting to get her back. But the marks had stayed with her into old age, a permanent record of what had been done to her body. The exhibition ran for 6 months. It drew more visitors than any previous show at the archive. Local newspapers covered it. A regional television station did a segment. Academics from other institutions reached out, asking how they could apply similar methods to their own collections. Dr. Chambers told Nadine that several longtime donors had complained. One had even threatened to demand the return of materials his family had contributed decades ago. But other donors had come forward, offering new collections with the explicit understanding that they wanted the full story told, not a sanitized version. "We're not going to please everyone," Chambers said, "but I think we're doing the right thing." The photograph of Eugenia and Diana hangs in the archive's permanent collection now. It has been reproduced in academic journals and popular magazines, in textbooks and documentaries. It has become an icon, a symbol of how the visual record of the American past can deceive us if we do not look carefully. But Nadine knows it is not unique. Old portraits are never neutral. They were staged by photographers, commissioned by clients, designed to project a particular image of wealth, respectability, and order. The people who controlled the camera controlled the narrative. And for most of American history, the people who controlled the camera were white. This means that the visual archive is full of hidden violence, hands positioned to conceal shackle marks, children posed in borrowed clothes to disguise their status, expressions carefully arranged to mask fear, grief, and rage. The violence is there, compressed into tiny details, waiting to be seen by someone willing to look. Nadine has seen other photographs since 2019 that tell similar stories. A portrait of a white family on a porch where, in the far corner of the frame, a black woman stands with her head bowed and her hands hidden behind her back. An image of 3 children playing, where one child's feet are positioned in a way that suggests she cannot move freely. A studio portrait of a young man in Confederate uniform, with a black boy standing at his elbow, holding his hat, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the camera. Each of these images has a story. Each of these images is evidence. And each of these images has been looked at 1,000 times by people who never saw what was actually there. The work of re-examining these photographs is slow and painful. It requires expertise in visual culture, in legal history, in the material conditions of bondage and servitude. It requires access to archives that have often been organized around the interests of white families, and it requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about institutions that many people would prefer to remember as benign. But it is necessary work, because every time we look at an old photograph and see only what its creators wanted us to see, we erase the people who were hidden in plain sight. We accept the lie of the matching dresses and the clasped hands. We fail the Dianas of history, the children who were taken and restrained and displayed as proof of their captors' benevolence. Diana survived. She got out. She built a family and a life and a legacy that stretches to the present day. But she should never have been put in that chair in the first place. She should never have been dressed up and photographed as someone's companion. She should never have had to carry the marks of bondage on her wrists for the rest of her life. The photograph cannot undo what was done to her, but it can bear witness to it if we are willing to look. So the next time you see a charming old portrait of 2 children, look again. Look at their hands. Look at their wrists. Look at the way they are positioned, the way their bodies are angled toward or away from each other. Look at their expressions, and ask yourself what the camera was really capturing and what it was trying to hide.